Well, welcome everybody. And as we're getting started here, I just wanted to give a big shout out and thank you to you, Saxton. For those of you joining us today, Saxton was a really big help behind the scenes, just helping me get an idea for our audience and what topics everybody here today may be interested in. So Saxton, thank you so much for all your time on the emails and the calls to help bring us to this moment. And thanks to BSN as well. I am extremely grateful to get to be here with a group of coaches today. We are here to talk about how we as coaches can help navigate the relationship between pressure and performance. And I do want to start off by acknowledging that that relationship can be one that facilitates the greatest performances. We've probably all witnessed that as coaches. And we've probably also seen it go the other direction where athletes internalize pressure a different way, one that takes them out of their game and more into their head. We've probably all witnessed some of that. I'd like to start off by asking you to use the chat for all of you as coaches. If you could remember back to a time when you were still competing, maybe some of you still do. If you could remember a time when you were performing and you noticed that you were experiencing some pressure that was getting in the way of your performance. And if you would put in the chat what you remember your coaches doing for you to help bring you into a state where you felt like you could focus on your performance. If you could remember that and put that in the chat now, that'd be great. I just saw the one from Lucky that said scream and add more pressure. Get out of your head, redirection, control the controllables, stop thinking, breathe and believe, breathe, telling me to take deep breaths. All right. See some really, next play, do it for you. Give me the brown paper bag. I love it. We could probably spend all day talking about some of the tactics that were used on us. And I wanted to ask that for a couple reasons. One, just to see what you remember, and also just to kind of normalize that a lot of the strategies that we use as coaches nowadays are the strategies that our coaches used with us or sometimes on us at times when we were competitors. So thanks for everybody for chiming in on that. And we can certainly keep those going. I'd like to start off with a story. A week ago, I was talking with actually, let me back up a little bit. Sorry to go so fast. I also want to let everybody know just a quick background that before I went full-time into sports psychology, I spent 14 years as a college soccer coach. And why I'm so passionate about getting on these calls with other coaches is because I believe that as coaches, we coach so much more than just technique, more than tactics. I think that all of you on the call today, you coach motivation, you coach focus, you coach self-belief. This is a group of people today on this call that will be remembered by their athletes as the impact that you made during the time when you coached these young men and women coming up. And I also know what it feels like as a coach to not feel like I could really help my players tap into their best selves, the best aspects of their performance. So that's really what compelled me to going into the field of sports psychology, is because I wanted to help my athletes be able to focus on their game without thoughts and feelings getting in the way. Which brings me to this story here. About a week ago, I had an athlete, professional soccer player. He and I speak twice a month. And we had one of our regularly scheduled mental performance coaching sessions. And he hit me up and he said, Ben, here's the deal. My coaches want me to play this weekend. this is a normal starter for them, but he has been battling an ankle injury. This is a really tough competitor. It takes a lot to keep him out. So the fact that he hadn't been playing said a lot. He had asked to play, or his coaches had asked him to play. And even though they were really aware that he was limited with his ankle, they talked about some medical things that could be done. But there was another story growing here that the team had not won in 4 games. It's the start of the season. Now they're 5 games into their professional season. And up to that point, they had drawn 2 games and they had lost 2 games. And as a regular starter for them, the coaches come and saying, hey, I need you to get back out there. And so the focus of our session, which is what I always ask athletes when I'm working with them, is what do you want the goal of our time together to be today? And he said, well, I don't want my focus to be on how frustrated I am that my ankle hurts. And so much of our conversation was, I'm not going to be able to do this. I'm probably not going to be able to do that. We're probably going to have to change this and probably going to have to change that. And as you can hear in a little bit of that story, a lot of his language was around what he wouldn't be able to do. A lot of his language was cemented in this idea that he was going to have to play the whole game with pain. And he was extremely worried that that was going to lead to even more frustration and that his focus would not be on the game. So I'm setting that table now, and we will come back to that story in a little bit. So what happens here when athletes are experiencing, or even us as coaches, are experiencing more of a negative relationship between pressure and performance, is the impact that this can have on a biological, psychological, and social perspective. And so just a couple things to notice and be aware of. And I'm also mindful that there may be other coaches on the call today with a background in sports psych, and that there's others that have a lot of experience this as well. So I'll try and keep this just kind of high level. This is definitely some of the stuff I wish I was more aware of younger in my coaching journey. First, from a biological perspective, when athletes start to get sped up or anxious or stressed, they can experience muscle tension. They can experience racing heart rate. They can experience dilated pupils. They can experience digestive issues. And those are just to name a few of the physiological states that athletes can experience when they're really under stress. From a psychological perspective, we get things like racing thoughts. We get things like ruminating or dwelling on the past. We get worry about the future. We get things like overthinking. Mindfulness expert Jack Cornfield says that we have anywhere between 60 and 90,000 thoughts a day that roll through our mind. And often those thought patterns are repetitive in nature and often really critical as well. So when we get under stress, and the definition we're using here is when demands exceed resources, especially when failure to meet those demands has significant consequences, that's when we can really get into these overthinking states, anxiety about the future, worried about outcomes, playing all sorts of what ifs. And so then that physical, psychological connection, what does that lead to from a social perspective? Well, there we get things like playing safe. We get athletes saying things like, I'm not myself. We get athletes that engage in less risk-taking. You know, when that athlete is in a flow state or in the zone, they're not overly caught up in the future or worried about making mistakes. They're playing free. And the opposite of that is playing safe, less risk-taking, playing not to lose. And we even see this in other aspects as well, where maybe it's more of a vocal athlete, more of a vocal leader on the team, where that athlete experiencing a negative relationship between pressure and performance may become more introverted, may communicate less, may be less likely to speak up. We get less eye contact. So I've given you kind of a quick breakdown on the biopsychosocial aspects that we may have witnessed and that athletes may experience. But I wanted to ask you to use the chat again. What have you seen in your athletes physically, or what have you heard them say verbally, or what have you witnessed in some of their behaviors that might have suggested to you that they were overly anxious or overly stressed about their performance? Just take a second there and put that in the chat if you would. Refusing to shoot, lashing out on coaches, saying I can't do this, stop communicating, unforced errors, blaming, rude, emotional outbursts, angry outbursts, afraid to do wrong. Yep. Thanks, everybody. Yep. And I love sourcing the group for that, because I think it's important to note that not all athletes will kind of manifest or express these anxious states the same way. So getting back to this performer that we talked about here, Lewis is his name. And getting back to Lewis, I was thinking to myself, okay, what can we do with this? So from a mental perspective, he's really overthinking about the future. From a physical perspective, worried that he's going to hurt the whole time. And so it led me to this. And this is kind of our mission statement. When I worked with the Toronto Blue Jays as the head of mental performance there, this was kind of what our go-to was. We said that elite performers can self-regulate their attention and emotion under pressure in any circumstance. Elite performers can self-regulate their attention and emotion under pressure in any circumstance. And I just really want to overemphasize, if you don't take anything away from today and what we're here to talk about, it's, as coaches, how can we move from coach regulating attention and emotion to getting our athletes to a place where they can self-regulate, where they can do it on their own. Because all those things that you put in the chat at the beginning, they were right. When your coaches came to you, when you were performing and said, take a deep breath, breathe and believe, calm down, all those things, those messages were the right messages. The problem with those messages is that the moment when we need them has already come and gone. And we want to get into really proactive ways of how we can help our athletes self-regulate their attention and their emotion. Getting back to the story of Lewis, what we did in that moment was I after listening for quite a while, I said, I've heard a lot about what you won't be able to do. Let's spend a little bit of time what you think you can do tonight. And that really opened up some brainstorming about, despite the physical challenges, what he was going to be able to do and the things that he thought he could do well. And just because I love a good story, I got a text message the next day thanking me for our time together, but more importantly, or as importantly, he played the full 90 minutes, had an assist in the game, and the team won 2-0. And just felt like that was a really good place for us to bring all of these things together today, because at any age and stage, it is always a good use of time to help our athletes be able to self-regulate. When they're under stress, when that heart is racing, when the mind is racing, it can make it really, really difficult to understand, where should I put my focus? How do I pay attention to the things that pay me back? So I've got 4 areas today that I want to touch on briefly, that as coaches, these are things that we can start to drip into our training environments I also want to acknowledge that many of you, or all of you, might already be doing some things proactively to train the mind to help your athletes be able to self-regulate. And also, this is not an exhaustive list. There are many interventions that coaches and sports psychs can use to help athletes be able to self-regulate their attention and emotion. I just picked 4 for today. So the first one is self-talk. The picture behind is Andy Murray's list that he had written for himself, that he put right next to his chair when he was competing. Self-talk is our ongoing internal dialogue that influences and reveals our thoughts, motivations, beliefs. And there are typically 3 types of self-talk. A lot of us are experts at the first one, which is negative self-talk. This is the type of self-talk that is highly, highly critical. One interesting / fun fact that fits into negative self-talk is something called the ironic process. And many of you are probably really familiar with this. The ironic process is when we use statements like don't do this or don't do that. And what the research shows on that is that conscious attempts to suppress thoughts often makes them more likely to surface. So when we say, don't putt short, or don't hit this out of bounds, anything that follows don't is typically what our mind and body latch onto after that. A second type of self-talk is positive self-talk. These are more affirmations. These are statements that some athletes may really latch onto. Back to our beginning where one of you was told by your coach, breathe and believe. There may have been a message behind that about what you wanted to believe in. The third type, and this is the type that in my practice, this is the one that I typically influence the most when I'm working with professional athletes, and it's instructional self-talk. Instructional self-talk is the type of self-talk that is task relevant and task specific. Back when I used to work with the Army Rangers, one of the tasks that they would have to perform at Ranger School was walking at a really tall height across a beam. And what we worked on was which type of statements would really facilitate the best performance. Would it be more helpful to say to yourself, don't look down, or you got this, or 1 foot in front of the other? And it was unanimous that the instructional self-talk of 1 foot in front of the other was most helpful. And if you're a tennis player, football player, golfer, really any type of coach that we have on here, what I'm thinking about now is how do we help our athletes come up with statements, usually that are really short and punchy, that when they need it can help keep their attention not on the feelings, but fully on the task. The second skill that I wanted to talk about today is mindfulness. And I'm mindful that many of us have heard this phrase by now. Mindfulness is defined by one of the experts, John Kabat-Zinn, is paying attention on purpose with moment-to-moment awareness, non-judgmentally. And I think there's some myths and stereotypes about what mindfulness is and isn't. In my practice, using this with athletes, we don't always close our eyes. We don't always sit still, but we always practice being in the moment. And more recently, around 2004, some of the research in sports psychology started to look at interventions that were less focused on making negative thoughts and feelings go away in order for athletes to be able to perform, and instead focusing more on accepting and being aware of negative thoughts and feelings that may show up. And there's some growing belief and growing practice that for some athletes, there may be more benefit spending time on accepting the fact that we're not always going to be thinking or feeling at our best when we perform. And to be able to notice that and accept that instead of spend a lot of energy trying to change that can be more facilitative. So some of the interventions that can be done here are really getting the athlete to, in some instances, close the eyes, connect with the breath, and do things like notice what's on the mind as opposed to judge what's on the mind. And for athletes that are having to make decisions moment by moment, this can be something that helps them really, going back to the two main things of today, self-regulating attention and emotion. They can notice quickly, is my focus inside my body on what I'm feeling, or is it outside my body on hitting this drive, nailing this shot, shooting this free throw? And these are things that we can practice. George Mumford, some of you may be familiar, he was the Bulls mindfulness coach, and Phil Jackson had brought him in. With the professional teams that I work with, and when I was with the Toronto Blue Jays, this was a main staple in our approach to mindset training with the players that we worked with. The third skill that I wanted to talk about today is just breath work. There is a really cool, for the football fans and the football coaches on here, there's a really cool video from Justin Fields, the Bears quarterback, that came out not too long ago, and he's being interviewed by the press, and they're asking him about some of the things he and his coaches have been working on, and this word patience comes up. And they start to ask him more about it, and he in a moment of disclosure, he says, honestly, I've just been focusing on my breath. And there is some really good research out there about how deliberate breathing or box breathing or square breathing, for example, where athletes take a 4-second inhale, a 4-second pause, a 4-second exhale, and a 4-second hold, can take the body from a sympathetic state, we're all familiar with fight or flight, to a parasympathetic state, which is this, our body's brake system, or when we get into rest and digest. And we see this all over sports. We see the athlete before the free throw taking the deep breath, the golfer at any stage of their pre-shot routine, the baseball player, the pitcher on the mound, the hitter in the box, where breath work is a big part of their pre-performance routine. When I was working with the Army Rangers, one of the leaders there had brought me over to help with a swim test that those soldiers had to perform. And just by taking 5 minutes of breath work before they did a water exercise, we were able to increase passing rates of that test by 20%, just by helping those soldiers take their focus off of outcomes and onto deliberate breathing. And this is something we can do just about anywhere with our athletes. The last one that I wanted to close out with today is the role that values can play in helping athletes regulate their attention and their emotion. And I want to go back to the story with Lewis, because before he and I got off the phone, and after we spent some time talking about all the things that he could do and all of the strengths that he does still possess when he competes, I asked him, I said, hey, if I were talking to your mom and dad right now, how would they describe you? And he came up with words like desire and commitment. And I asked him to tell me what a committed performance would look like. And immediately it shifted away from all the things that were in the way and all the things that might keep him from his best performance, and onto some of these words that he wanted others to use to define him as a human and as a performer. Our values are our principles that guide our day-to-day actions. My favorite metaphor for values is this idea of it's the lighthouse in the storm. And there are times where our athletes are going to feel like they are that ship at sea. And to be able to go to them and ask what defines you can have a real stabling effect on them being able to self-regulate. I was working with a professional pitcher when I was with the Jays, and we had the same conversation, and the word that came up was loyalty. And I asked him what that meant. What does it mean to be loyal? And he was able to describe that no matter how his performance was going, he was going to stay loyal to what his process was on the mound, loyal to what his routine was. So in closing out, just a couple things. I really want to reinforce where aspirationally I hope we can all work towards and get to as coaches, which is helping our athletes be able to self-regulate in the moment, physically, mentally, emotionally, when they feel themselves getting sped up. What tools can we have given them as coaches to help them really land in the moment and be present? And the other idea, just to kind of close out here, is as a coach, you may be thinking, Ben, when can we train this, and how can we train this? And one of the things that I thought really worked well for us when I was with the Toronto Blue Jays, originally when I had got there, we were doing didactic presentations like we're doing today. We were talking about mental skills, but nothing in here is groundbreaking. None of you, none of us, and if any athlete were watching this presentation, none of them would be feeling any pressure right now. So what we started doing was more micro dosing of these skills in the training environment, like while hitters were in the batting cage, or in a soccer environment before a striker goes and does a finishing drill, or in a football practice in between breaks. How can we take 2 minutes or 5 minutes to practice some of these skills? I think one of the things I'd really want to encourage is these do not have to be 30, 45, 60-minute presentations with our players. What we want to get to is in the practice environment, when they are sweating in pads under pressure, how can we teach them and encourage them to use these skills? I'm a big believer that it's not a skill unless it holds up under pressure. So this is something that as coaches, we've got to train, and a little bit of microdosing every day, I think, beats long-winded presentations some of the time. Last chat question I have for the group: when and where, and I just want to acknowledge these are just 4 interventions: values, self-talk, breath work, mindfulness. When and where might you see yourself using and teaching some of these skills in your team environments? If you could put that in the chat. Great. Yeah, weight room. Love that. Thanks, everyone. So just to close out here, and then Saxton, I will turn it back over to you. As a reminder, it's not a skill unless it holds up under pressure. And I'm just a big believer that mental skills, just like physical and technical skills, are something that we really have to train. And I also believe that I'm on the call today with the best group of people to train it. I really think you are your team. You're already your team's sports psychologist. You're already the one that's having these conversations. And my goal today was that we could get on and talk about how skills of mindfulness, breath work, value setting, and self-talk could help our athletes be able to self-regulate their attention and their emotion when they need it the most. And with that, Saxon, if we have questions, I will turn it over to you, and just want to thank everyone for jumping on today and being with us for today's presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And that was absolutely amazing content. I know these coaches got a lot of information out of it. First question we got is from Jessica. She said, just wondering where to get more training in sports psychology in general. She is a coach turning into school counselor and would love to do specific training in it as she feels it would be valuable to her.
Well, there's formal routes. I know more and more schools out there are offering master's degrees, for example, in sports psychology that can be done in person or online. That was I was you back in 2010, so hungry to learn this that I went back to school to get my master's in it while I was coaching. I would say that the next best option that I've seen out there are there's just some really good books. There's Performance Under Pressure, Performing Under Pressure. There's books like Coaching Athletes to Be Their Best. And Saxon, I could get with you after and email out some of these references for the coaches if they'd like them.
Yes, absolutely. I think that would be great.
I can kind of generate a deeper response. But I would say there's formal. I would say there's the informal. And the other one that I just loved doing is when I was a college coach, I was going to other coaches' offices, the basketball coach, the football coach, and very rarely would we talk about anything other than the athlete mindset. How do we get our players to help them be more consistent, focus more? And so I would do some sourcing of peers and find out what they've learned and what they're doing. There were some excellent recommendations in the chat today. I saw a couple on the power of the breath and things like that. So I'd be checking in with peers.
Awesome. Thank you. And then Darren asked, what is the best way to handle youth athletes that beat themselves up over every mistake by crying and showing anger?
I wish I knew the best way. So the anger outburst and the beating themselves up, again, without knowing more context, I'd think that fear of failure, perfectionism, needing to be perfect. I'd be really curious about what that athlete. I might start with what that athlete is telling themselves, and trying to get an idea of what that internal narrative is. The next thing that I'd be curious on from an intervention perspective is, what are this athlete's goals? If they're only outcome goals, those have a varied degree of controllability, often a lot less control. And again, this is just speaking off the context that I know of, crying and getting really angry. I might really work on pulling that back and establishing some process goals, establishing some short-term goals, giving that athlete something that they could focus on in the short term. And then any of those strategies, the breath work, like we talked about, and coming up with some values. Man, the values work just is really speaking out to me right now. Is, if this young athlete is defining themselves as, failure, if they're not getting it right all the time, and they haven't spent any time on some values that they would like to use to describe them, any type of work, inner work on some value setting goals, being able to set especially process goals. Again, with the short context, those might be a couple areas. I mean, there's so other layers too. How much pressure is this athlete having put on them by their parents or peers or siblings or coaches? There could be some other factors there, but from an intervention idea, those might be a couple that I go with.
Great. And then Benjamin asked, when working with teams or larger groups, how do you get them to buy into what you're talking about or your messaging?
Awesome question. Usually getting them to buy in is, so I had to do this when I first went in with one of the pro soccer teams that I work with currently. I had the same question for myself: is how am I going to get these guys to care about these skills? And so I started with an assumption. I said, hey, my assumption is that all of you want to play as long as you can. All of you want to have as many consistent performances as you can. And all of you want to get paid as much as you can. And the answers to those three questions were yes, yes, and yes. And then I went on to talk about how mental skills can be a competitive advantage. And I also believe, I love this question so much. I believe that athletes already use some of these skills. The problem is, or the opportunity is, a lot of times they default to them. They aren't using them by design. So they're practices that they use some of the time, as opposed to practicing them almost every day like they do other aspects of the game. The third and final way that I've gotten professional athletes to buy in is that all the work with me is optional. So when I go and I work with a team, and I've got 2 pro teams that I work with right now, all of the athletes know that my sessions are not mandatory, and that if they want to come, it's because it's on their own accord. My philosophy on doing this work is that people are the experts on their own life. And when you treat them that way, you're going to get a different performer showing up. And so in a lot of places, it's me trusting that. And what I've seen over time is when it's optional, and you get early buy-in from a couple players and say, hey, that was cool. Hey, we did some fun stuff. Hey, that helped me. They're going to be the best marketers of a program like this.
We have lots of questions coming in the chat.
Let's
Pam
go.
asked, how do I help individual athletes with their values when their own goals conflict with what their parents expect?
Oh, that's really good. So one of the things I'm a big fan of, and I'm not sure if there's a youth version or if age even matters on this, but there is a free website called VIA. It's VIA Character Strengths. It comes out of the field of positive psychology. There can be a quick assessment there to kind of give indicators on values / character strengths. The second is, if it were me, I'm having this meeting with the parents, and because I'm mindful of the dangers of especially in youth sports, of keeping parents in the dark on things, especially because these are minors. So I'd be curious on how we can help this young athlete that we're talking about here get clear on the principles that they want to define them. And again, I'm sorry, because I don't have the context. This coach may be saying, oh man, Ben, you're missing it. But that's my negative self-talk right there. I would want to see if we could include the parents in the process. I'd want the athlete to talk about what does define them. There's a really cool exercise out there, and you can download this for free. It's called the Values Bullseye. The Values Bullseye, and it can assess values in recreation, in our day-to-day life, in relationships, and we can kind of do a self-assessment on how close to the center we are of doing that. Another option might be empowering the athlete to have that conversation with their parents about the values conflict, and explain to them what does matter to them and how they want to live more of that in their life.
Awesome. Our next question asks, what are some simple things that can be done by high school players to help with self-confidence?
So Albert Bandura is probably the world leader in sources of self-efficacy. Visualization is visualization and mastery experiences would be my top two go-to. So first we'll go with mastery experiences. Mastery experiences are the athlete remembering that they have been there and done that. It's the quarterback remembering that he has nailed that pass. It's the archer remembering she has hit that shot. And it is helping our athletes go back to moments where they themselves have had success in similar situations. Second, visualization. It's getting the athlete to see them. I think everybody on here is probably the most familiar with that one. So I'll skip over that. The third way is through something called vicarious experience. And that would be where if I'm looking to boost my confidence or belief that I can do something, I'm looking around to people like my teammates. And when I see different players that are of close to similar skill sets, and I see them having success, there are ways that I can borrow confidence from that and say things like, I can do that too.
Awesome. I think this next one's a great question. Brandon asked, how would you help athletes who struggle with the pressure of following in a relative's footsteps?
Oh, man. Oh, I've seen that a lot, especially in pro sports. I think this is really a kind of a part of just the whole self-comparison and how often that can trip athletes up. Again, I'd start with values. I would want to work with this athlete on how they want to define themselves and how they want others to define them. I'd be curious on how that self-comparison with that relative, how that was impacting their performance in different ways. Because one of the things I might be curious on are there any positives at all to that? I also think, going back to mindfulness work and really helping athletes be in the present moment and really notice their thinking. And if a lot of this thinking is around self-comparison and comparing every performance to when that father, mother, uncle, or brother did it, how can we help them really establish their own identity, not only in sport, but outside of sport as well? That may be a big area to touch on. Is it might be easy to make that comparisons in an athlete context, but how do we parse that out as well as explore who is this person when they're not competing? Man, that is a really, really good question. And I'm sure there's a couple other ways we could go with that, but that's top of mind right there, Saxton.
Awesome. The next question asked, how do you know when you're pushing or challenging your athletes too much or too far, and when do you pull back?
Oh, hmm. Um, hmm. Well, Dan Coyle talks about this in the talent code about knowing kind of when athletes need an arm around the shoulder and when they kind of need other types of persuasion. I'll just leave it at that. I'd want to ask them. I'd want to ask them early on in the season as we're developing relationship with an athlete. I'd want to know about their goals. I'd want to know about their ambitions. If an athlete says, look, I'm here for the social aspects of sport, I don't know if I'm going to play beyond high school or beyond middle school. That's going to give me an indicator on how hard they want to be pushed. If I've got an athlete who's telling me I want to be a college athlete. I want to be a professional athlete. And I can get them to really describe to me why they want that. I think a lot of this will come out of what we learn from an athlete, from a human, when we talk to them about their ambitions. Because I think if we're needing to get into those moments where should I push harder or should I push back? Some of these previous conversations may give us key insights into the decision that we make in that moment. I don't think there are any absolutes at all when it comes to this. And I also think a lot of the answer to this hinges on the coach's philosophy on, hey, what happens between the lines or when we show up for practice or on game day. I think part of that is clarifying expectations as a coach early on. And I think that's what helps the athlete as well, because there's another side of this is, as an athlete, how much do I want my coach to push me? Am I ready for that? Am I a good fit for this program? I think so much of that really is dependent on really good communication early on, where coaches are clarifying what their own expectations are during the athlete experience, and where athletes can clarify to coaches about, this is what I'd like to achieve during my time here. And then we can get into some conversations on what would that look like? And hey, on days when you're not feeling it, or on days when I'm really feeling it and I think you have another level, what are your expectations of me as a coach? I think we're starting to see more of these proactive dialogues occur within coach-athlete relationships. And I think that's just such a healthy way to go about this, is getting the athlete perspective on it.
Awesome. And the last one we have, basically, coach is saying that their team lacks a lot of the grit that the other schools might have, and they don't really fight. So how do we build the capacity and add it to their toolkit for their life's challenges?
Saxon, can you read that one more time about the fight part?
Sure. So basically, Catherine is saying that their school lacks a lot of grit as other high schools, and that they don't fight during the games as much, and asks, how do we build that capacity and add it to their toolkit for life's challenges?
I liked one of the coach's answers earlier, when we talked about where do we drip in these mental skills. I'm asking myself as a coach, the coach responded, weight room was one of them, and they listed off two others as well. That's where my mind goes right away, is how do I drip competition? How do I drip that into my training environment? How do I start to put competition and consequences? How do I praise? If we're looking to see more grit and more fight, how do I shine a spotlight on it in a positive way when I do see it? For example, one of the pro teams that I have right now, one of their team values is intensity. And when they do their film review, they have moments in the game that have nothing to do with scoring a goal or conceding a goal, but it just might highlight a player who's demonstrating championship level intensity. It might be going hard into a tackle. It might be saving a ball from going out of bounds. It might be diving for something or putting their body in harm's way. And so if I'm doing an intervention with this team, I'm going to come in and I'm going to ask them to describe to me what fighting looks like, what that feels like. I'm going to ask them to describe to me times during the season already when they feel like, as individuals or as a team, that they have fought. I'm going to start to come up with a list of maybe 10 fighting behaviors and things that we can do in the weight room, on the practice field, and certainly on game day. And then I'm going to want to track that. I'm going to want to talk about it at every team meeting. And to me, it's going to be one of those things that over time just really gets dripped into our culture. I also think for this coach, clearly this is important to them that have asked the question today. And so I'd ask you to tell a story to your team about what fighting means to you and about why it's so important. And also tie that to other aspects of their life where it's going to pay them back beyond sport. Those are a couple top of mind things.